Hello and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. This is where you'll find extended versions of my interviews on public television. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today we are digging into one of the most urgent and underreported global crises of our time, forced migration. Right now, there are over 123 million people who've been forced from their homes. That's the highest number ever recorded, and double what it was just 10 years ago. These are men, women, and children forced to flee because of war, political collapse, climate crisis. Some are escaping Russian missiles in Ukraine, others violence in Sudan, humanitarian disaster in Gaza, Taliban rule in Afghanistan. Still more have fled crumbling states like Venezuela. And contrary to widespread opinion in wealthier nations, the vast majority are hosted in low and middle income countries. Millions of displaced people never even cross an international border at all, meaning the world's most dangerous, under-resourced, and fragile places are shouldering a disproportionately high share of the burden. Yet just as the need has exploded, the global aid system is unraveling. The United States, once its biggest donor, has drastically pulled back, and the effects are being felt around the world. No one is stepping in to fill that GZERO vacuum. Joining me to discuss the crisis, the impact of U.S. aid cuts, and where he sees glimmers of hope with so many intractable problems, David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. Let's get to it. David Miliband, good to have you back.
Yeah, good to be here.
I want to start with something positive. You were just in Syria. You made it back. A lot of people going these days. You probably wouldn't have gone to Syria a couple of years ago.
Well, we've worked in Syria for the last 10, 12 years. We, the International Rescue Committee, both in the northwest of Syria, where you had rebel groups in control, northeast, Kurds.
You weren't in Aleppo, though.
We were in Aleppo, but then were driven out of Aleppo.
Yeah.
When it became held by the government. We were working in the rebel-held areas. Look, it's a remarkable situation in Syria because the destruction is enormous. I mean, great tracts of land, great towns just flattened across the road from the citadel in Aleppo, destruction. But at the same time as all this destruction, enormous sense of possibility. Every single person you talk to, an IRC staff member, a client, a doctor in a hospital, when you say to them, are you optimistic about the future? They say, I'm more optimistic than I was 6 months ago.
And then they have been for decades.
Much more than they have been because 50 years of Assad family rule and a chance that they can make their own future. Obviously, massive pressure on the government to get its timeline for politics and social renewal and economic change in sync, but a real sense of possibility.
I mean, for the last 10 years, conversations with you have been about more and more and more displaced people, more refugees. Syria, are we starting to see large numbers go back and rebuild?
Globally, there are more and more refugees, 122 million refugees and displaced people, but Syria, 450,000 people have gone back since December last year.
In 6 months. Yeah.
So in this calendar year, already 450,000, about 80 to 100,000 have left. So it's not all one-way traffic. A lot of people going back, checking out the situation, going back to their families out of Syria, many in Turkey, many in Lebanon and Jordan, many in Germany, Sweden. So there's a lot of movement, but there's also a sense in the government. I had a chance to speak to the president, the foreign minister, as well as our own staff and clients there. They know they've got to make Syria a welcoming place for all Syrians. As you go in, it says at the passport office, if you're a Syrian coming home, welcome back to rebuilding your country. So there's a sense that it's got to be, if not pluralistic, at least inclusive in its organization, in its politics, in its polity.
Now, the United States has, on the one hand, said we want to take some of those sanctions off, give them an opportunity. On the other hand, hasn't been playing a very active role in rebuilding. What is the international community looking like for Syria right now?
Well, the international community is absent, but the regional community is on side. That's the distinction I would make.
The Gulf states in particular now,
especially Saudi Arabia, very important. Especially Qatar, very important as well. The United States did play one important role, and President Trump was at the center of this. he recognized the need to lift the sanctions that had existed both on the country and on the individual organizations. So after a meeting with President al-Sharaa, he wiped off all the sanctions, which has opened the door to investment. Now, the timeline
Which allows the Gulf states to send the money in, because otherwise they would be subject to these sanctions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you avoid the sanctions jeopardy, but it takes time. And that's where the timeline problem comes about, because there's month by month growing demand for progress from the Syrian population, but a longer term renewal process that's hundreds of billions of dollars.
For Trump, a big part of this has been an idea that Syria is going to soon join the Abraham Accords. You think that's a possibility?
It's a long way off from that. Remember, there's still occasional bombing of southwestern Syria by Israel. President al-Sharaa has been clear that he wants to make sure that he's not at war with Israel. That's different from signing the Abraham Accords. So I think that's well off. But we could be in a situation where there's a renewal of the 1974 pact about the Golan Heights, where there is some kind of standoff. I think it's clear that for President al-Sharaa, he's got to focus domestically. He doesn't want trouble in the neighborhood.
I know it was a short meeting, and I know it was translated, but still, there aren't many people that are watching the show right now that have had a chance to meet with Syria's new leader. Give me a little bit of a sense of what you took away from him as a human being.
I took away focus. I took away clarity. I took away real pride that he feels in having overthrown a regime who many saw as living forever. I also saw someone who's quite worldly. I mean, he's played the diplomatic game with the United States, with the regional neighbors, very adroitly. And this is someone who shouldn't be underestimated.
Okay, so it's nice to start with some good news. And for now, at least, very fragile, but good news. Most of the world that you're looking at right now, that your people are on the ground right now, are not facing good news. The numbers are up. The humanitarian crises are growing. It doesn't feel sustainable. I mean, we're talking about dozens of essentially failed and failing states that no one's stepping in to fix. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think you're pointing to one of the symptoms of a GZERO world, a leaderless world, a world without rules and without guardrails. Because in 20 countries in crisis, there are about 275 million people in humanitarian need. That means they depend on organizations like the International Rescue Committee to survive. There's a total 300 million people in humanitarian need, but the preponderance of them is in these 20 crisis-ridden countries, led by Sudan, led by Gaza, led by, until December, Syria,
DRC as well.
Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yeah.
There, also Myanmar, places that get forgotten. And tens of millions of people in each of those countries. Sudan, to take an example, 16 million people in humanitarian need, 3 million refugees in neighboring very poor countries like South Sudan, a lot of regional meddling on all sides of the civil conflict. And those places are not sustainable. That's why people are leaving them. That's why people are dying there. And the scale of impunity, the loss of international engagement is epic, really. And we face a new abnormal. 10 years ago, there were 50 to 60 million internally displaced people and refugees. Now there's 120 million internally displaced people and refugees. That's not economic migrants appearing at the southern border. These are people who are fleeing conflict and violence. You say Sudan, you realize this is a political problem, a political emergency, not just an economic
And that's what, about
one.
10 million of that number, just Sudan at this point.
Well, yeah, you're right. In terms of, if you add together the internal displacement plus the refugees who've gone into neighboring states, you're over 10 million people. Now, that is not a sustainable situation, even if the aid system was working with full disbursements of money at 0.7% of GNP, which is the UN target, and it was being delivered in the most effective ways. Neither of those things are happening at the moment. The aid budgets are being shrunk, led by the US, obviously, and there's huge challenge of the aid budget being spread too thin. From the acute emergencies through to the preparedness against COVID, the next COVID, we're not doing a good enough job. And so it's to go back to your question, what you face Is fragile states becoming failing states becoming so failed that they export their own problems? Because none of these situations remain confined within the countries that they start.
Now, in the case of Syria, you said there's a failure of the international community, but there's success of the regional community after the revolution occurred. Sudan, we don't have success of the regional community. There's been talks, there's been engagement, say, well, we know we need the military leadership out, but the countries in the region with an awful lot of money and that should want an end to this war haven't prioritized it. Why aren't even the regional actors doing more to bring this war to an end?
The tragedy of all ongoing wars is that both sides think they can still win. That's the story of Sudan. It's the story of Ukraine that you know well. And you've got supporters of both sides in Sudan piling in to support each side. The scale of the abrogation of responsibility of the international system is very, very high indeed. The UN is blocked from doing its work. There are all sorts of attempts to block what NGOs are doing. So you've got essentially the implosion of the country under the duress of, on the one hand, sponsorship of war, on the other hand, the retreat of diplomacy. We talk about an imbalanced world, a world out of balance. And one of the imbalances is that between the use of hard power and diplomacy. Hard power on the increase, diplomacy in retreat. Sudan is the preeminent case of it.
So if we were to look at all the conflicts out there, is there another one or two that you think we might be getting close to a resolution, and why?
Well, let me give you
because Sudan clearly isn't it.
Let me give you the case where there's so much tragedy if we don't get it right now. The US and Qatar have brokered some kind of halt in fighting in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. This is a 30, 40-year set of civil conflicts. It involves external actors as well as internal strife. The government's writ doesn't run across the whole country. The need for implementation of this cessation of hostilities is absolutely preeminent because tens of millions of people's lives are at stake there. And it's the kind of place that will so suffer if it doesn't have the world's attention. A little bit of attention can make a big difference, but if it doesn't get attention on the humanitarian track, on the economic track, because there's enormous rentier state there, but also on the political track, then the consequences are not just confined to the Eastern DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, they spill out much more broadly indeed.
All this is happening at a time that the United States has shut down USAID, is dramatically reducing its foreign aid footprint. How has that affected your operations around the world?
Yeah, the US was the anchor of the global aid system. And I use that metaphor advisedly. It calmed troubled waters through the scale of what the US did and the breadth of what it did. Not just for my organization, but for the whole system. Everything from preparedness in respect of famines to emergency relief after earthquakes and everything in between. The US was more or less 4 in every $10 of the global aid system, 3.5 to 4 in 10 of every $10.
And only about $2.50 of every 10 in terms of GDP. So it was actually punching above its weight globally.
Well, as a share of its own GDP, US aid spend is actually very small. I mean, American public opinion polls suggest the American public believe that a quarter of the American budget goes into aid. In fact, 0.18%, less than 0.2% of national income goes towards aid. But at a global level, it was a big and serious aid player, more or less on a par with all the European Union countries plus the EU budget put together. When you pull up the anchor on a boat in choppy waters, you know well the boat rocks and the passengers get seasick. That's what's happening at the moment. Just to bring it down to my own organization, we've lost more or less $140 million of international funding. We've had to close programs affecting about 2 million people in places like Afghanistan, education, South Sudan, help for refugees from Sudan. It's a very big shock to the system. And it's on top of that, there's a lot of uncertainty because we don't know what's coming next. We still have about 30 grants and contracts with the US government, but they're all coming up for renewal because these are often short-term grants. And our plea to the administration is not to pull the rug from under vital services. They've said they want to continue them. Secretary Rubio, when he was a senator, spoke very powerfully about the benefits, the soft power benefits, as well as the human benefits of this American funding. And for all the need for reform, which we would put ourselves at the forefront of, higher impact, better evidence, more innovation, all of that needed. But the anchor being pulled up is costing lives and making a huge difference around the world.
So who's coming in? I mean, for an organization like yours, of course, it's very popular to say, well, the Americans are leaving. What an opportunity for China. I mean, have there been any Chinese leaders, formal or informal, that have said, hey, we could have more of a role in the IRC. That would look good for us?
Yeah, I was in China in March, and they're very disciplined, in my experience of talking both in and out of government. They see enormous opportunity in de-Americanization of the global system, but they're not going to move into the humanitarian aid business. That's not their area. They have done an agreement with UNICEF in Cambodia to step in, but they're not playing on the humanitarian track. They have a very strong economic development drive, as you know, through Belt and Road Initiative and related efforts. They have quite grandiose strategies for global security, global development, global civilization, global security, but they don't want to get drawn in. And the truth is, the great sucking sound you can hear is money leaving the humanitarian aid sector, but it's not being replaced. There's some private philanthropy coming in, but if you listen to the Gates Foundation, they'll tell you we're having to rethink, because we can't replace one-for-one, anything like one-for-one, what USAID and the State Department were previously doing. Europeans are not in the position they were in 2017, 2018, because they're super burdened by the Ukraine challenge, never mind their own debt issues post the COVID crisis. So at the moment, the poorest people in the world are suffering a double whammy. One, the reduction in aid flows. Secondly, global interest rates are higher than they were a couple of years ago. So health and education budgets in poor countries are being raided to pay off debts, and that means there's less to go around domestically.
So no one sees this as a soft power opportunity?
Not at the moment, but you are seeing serious debate in the Gulf about what they should do with their money. Now, we have to keep this in perspective. The Saudi economy is $1 trillion economy, which is very high per head, but remember, the US is a $30 trillion economy. So we've got to keep a sense of scale, but nonetheless, there's real thinking there. There's real thinking in countries like Turkey about what role they're going to play. But I would say that for countries like Japan, which are very big development spenders, there are big challenges about what's the focus of their aid flow is going to be in the future, and how are they going to play into this big soft power competition that's starting.
So if you had a crystal ball and the United States for the next 3 years, 3.5 years, Trump administration is still going to continue to be largely absent from the space that it has served the anchor, who do you think is going to be the biggest player out there?
Well, the biggest player is going to be the European Union over that period, because it's now the largest aid donor in the world.
Will they do it in a coordinated way?
Well, by definition, they are coordinated because
the spend is, yeah.
And also, the spend runs until the 1st of January 2028. The great thing about European Union budgets is that 7-year budgets often take 7 years to negotiate, but once they're fixed, then you've got some certainty. So until the 1st of January 2028, we know that European development and humanitarian spend is going to put it right at the forefront. And I don't see anyone supplanting them. The big issue is, where does the money go? Does it go towards the fragile and conflict states? And does it have the political shoulder weight behind it to open up aid flows in places like Sudan and Gaza, where people in desperate need are being blocked from receiving the aid that they require?
Now, one of the things that I've most enjoyed reading about from you has been talk of this age of impunity. The fact that when you don't have anyone upholding the global norms and rules and values, some of the people that become much more powerful are those that are truly not restrained and don't want to be restrained by those rules. Where's that heading right now?
Well, the age of impunity is becoming an age of cruelty. And the age of impunity is defined by the exercise of power without responsibility, checks and balances absent from the exercise of power. But the scale of cruelty now that is being exercised is a measure of the impunity. I chair the advisory board of the Atlas of Impunity, which is published by the Eurasia Group. And that measures for 170 countries in the world what it's like for citizens of those countries across 5 dimensions of impunity. And what we find is that in the acute cases of conflict and violence, the level of impunity that is suffered by civilians in places like Syria during the civil war, in places like Ukraine because of the Russian invasion, in places like Sudan or Gaza because of the ongoing conflict, sky-high levels of impunity. They can't rely on the rights that are enumerated for civilians in the UN Charter, but no one's there to uphold them. And that age of impunity is taking strides forward. The age of accountability that we talked about 15 or 20 years ago is frankly in retreat. And it's going to take a massive push from governments, from civil society, from brave civilians and journalists and human rights advocates to uphold some of those basics.
Any surprises from you in countries that we think of as being responsible and accountable that actually come kind of high on the impunity index?
Well, the US should be much higher than it is. It's below the average. Some of you'd expect Finland or the Nordic countries to have high levels of accountability. But one of the remarkable things about the Atlas of Impunity, it measures impunity in conflict and violence. It measures it in governance, measures it in human rights. It also measures it in the economy, which is about states grabbing property rights as well as private companies exploiting workers. And it frames the environmental crisis as a crisis of impunity as well. Impunity of this generation against future ones that have no votes yet, and of people against the planet. So Canada scores much worse than you would expect because we rank on environment. I think it's also important to say that because we've been doing the Atlas of Impunity for 3 years now and have got data, some data that goes back 5 or 10 years, you can see some quite big movers. The 2 of the biggest movers this year in this year's Atlas of Impunity were Sierra Leone and Guatemala. Both of them have improved on the Atlas of Impunity. Countries like Thailand, Saudi Arabia, they've also improved over the last 10 years. There are also countries that have got worse. So it's becoming a dynamic index, not just a static one.
I thought I'd take a few moments at least to ask you about what's happening in the UK right now. I mean, we have a relatively new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, someone who has a lot of background in issues that you are actually very passionate about, in, human rights, international lawyer, but he's not performing very well on the ground in the UK. What do you think his principal challenges are right now, and why is he not addressing them adequately?
Well, his biggest challenges are an inheritance of stagnant economy, denuded, degraded public services, and the after effects of austerity, of Brexit, which is a daily drain on the performance of the British economy.
Still, years and years on.
No question about it. Brexit is a daily drain on the performance of the British economy.
Lost the integration, lost the talent.
Yeah, and we've just seen figures from the London School of Economics about the service sector. The service sector has actually been doing, quote unquote, quite well compared to the goods sector in the UK over the last few years. But what the LSE have done is shown that even in the service sector, the hit because of Brexit is a daily drain on the British economy, never mind on the wider political, social, cultural exchange that was part of it. So,
and most Brits, by the way, regret the fact that Brexit has happened at this point.
So it's 9 years on from the vote, but also the after effects of COVID. So we've got to recognize that he faces the challenge. The challenge is not just of one sphere, but of a real grouping of crises. Now, here's what I would say about the Starmer government in the UK. Don't underestimate the methodical way in which they're putting in place plans and changes that are intended to have long-term effect, not a short-term impact. He's taking on the chin that Rome wasn't built in a day. He's really trying to lay down the planks, both on the economic side, the social side, the public sector renewal. And if you look at the most successful areas, health waiting lists are going down. They've got a 10-year plan for this. So there's still a lot of waiting in the National Health Service. They've rewritten their fiscal rules so that capital expenditure gets reprioritized because it's been undermined. On net zero, they're driving forward as well. So you can point to areas where they're still at the planning stage, but where they've got means and ends together, I think you can see how this is a government banking on long-term change, not short-term.
If you want to go long-term, though, you want to make sure that your short-term decisions economically, you don't look weak. You don't have to back away from what you said you're going to do. And so far, at least, on their budget, they've had big problems.
Yeah, they've had big challenges, especially in respect of welfare state reform. And that speaks to how they have to get at any time in politics, you have to have your direction clear, your purpose clear, the rigor of your policy agenda, and then the narrative explaining it. And in a couple of welfare state areas, they haven't managed to do that, and they've had to step back before making another step forward. And so what I would say is that one of the strengths of the British system is they've got a strong majority in Parliament. They've got a clear and steady Prime Minister at the helm, and he's banking on the fact that he can deliver change within 4 or 5 years, which is the electoral cycle, and that people want to see a 10-year plan, not just a short-term sugar rush. And I think that's a good bet, but it's one that's going to take enormous teamwork and enormous discipline.
We've had a lot of shows on technology and particularly AI. And when I think about sustainable development goals, I think about AI as one of the few things coming out there that could make a real difference. Have you seen any use cases thus far that have been positive for refugees and for humanitarian aid that's come from these new technologies?
Yes, I can. It's really important to highlight that data plus technology can mean massive performance and productivity gains for the poorest people in the world, as well as for the richest people in the world. So let me give you some examples. Yeah. When we deliver information now to people on the run from conflict through our Signpost global program, we can translate through AI so that it's in every local language that you need. When we try and help kids who are displaced by conflict and need to continue their education, we've now got an education program that uses computer-aided learning in very, very tailored effect. We've got a very interesting example at the moment of diagnosing mpox by taking photographs of lesions to ensure that we have quick diagnosis even beyond the reach of health systems. So we have the use cases. What we don't yet have is the investment in infrastructure or programmatic scale that could really deliver the kind of transformation that I think is made possible by this technological advance.
David Miliband, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thank you very much.
That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World Podcast. Do you like what you heard? Of course you do. Why not make it official? Why don't you rate and review GZERO World? 5 stars, only 5 stars, otherwise don't do it. On Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends.